Imagine standing in the heart of Athens during the height of its golden age. The sun catches the white marble of the Parthenon. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and sea salt, and the roar of the assembly echoes through the streets. In this world of men, of philosophers, generals, and politicians, one name is whispered with a mixture of reverence and pure, unadulterated venom. She is not a citizen. She has no legal right to speak in public, yet she is rumored to be the true architect of the Athenian Empire. She is Aspasia of Miletus. History remembers her as a mistress, a seductress, and even a madam, but the reality is far more dangerous to the established order of the time. She was a woman who possessed a mind so sharp it could cut through the rhetoric of the greatest orators of antiquity, and her influence was so profound that her enemies were willing to tear down the entire city just to silence her. What follows is an investigation into the life of a woman who hacked the social code of the ancient world, the psychological warfare used to destroy her, and the terrifying price of being the smartest person in a room that doesn't want you there. By the end of this journey, we will uncover how Aspasia navigated a landscape of absolute patriarchy to become the most powerful woman in the Mediterranean. Why the democracies of the past were so uniquely terrified of the female intellect. We'll see how a campaign of character assassination, fueled by the same mass manipulation tactics we see today, was deployed to bring her down. And we'll ask whether the golden age of Athens was built on her brilliance or her blood. If you're fascinated by the hidden figures who pull the strings of history and the psychological maneuvers of the elite, you'll find exactly what you're looking for here. Consider joining our community for more deep dives into the shadows of the past by subscribing to the channel. To understand Aspasia, we have to look at the psychological cage that was 5th century Athens. For a woman born in the city, life was a series of closed doors. You were a daughter, then a wife, then a mother, and rarely were you seen or heard outside the home. But Aspasia was an outsider. Born in Miletus around the year 470 BCE, she came from a city on the coast of modern-day Turkey that was a melting pot of Persian, Ionian, and Greek thought. Miletus was a place of science and philosophy, a place where the boundaries of what a woman could be were slightly more porous. When she arrived in Athens as a young woman, she brought with her a different blueprint. She was what the Greeks called a hetera, while often translated as courtesan. The term is misleading. In the hierarchy of Athenian social life, a hetera was a woman who was highly educated, independent, and capable of engaging in the complex intellectual sparring that the Athenian elite craved. They were the only women allowed to attend to the symposia, those famous wine-soaked drinking parties where the philosophy and politics of Western civilization were born. Aspasia didn't just attend these parties, she dominated them. This was her first great psychological maneuver. She realized that in a society where men were obsessed with status and intellectual dominance, a woman who could outthink them was both an intoxicating novelty and a profound threat. She established a salon that became the intellectual ground zero of Athens. Even Socrates, the man who would eventually die for his pursuit of truth, was said to have visited her frequently, bringing his pupils with him to listen to her speak. There are strong signs in the historical record, including the writings of Plato, that Aspasia was a master of rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Some scholars even hypothesize that she may have been the ghostwriter for some of the most famous speeches in history. But this level of influence came with a cost. In the eyes of the Athenian public, a woman who could control the minds of men must be using something other than logic. They began to suspect she was using magic, or worse, the kind of sexual manipulation that could topple an empire. This suspicion turned to open hostility when she caught the eye of the most powerful man in the world, Pericles. In the year 445 BCE, Pericles was the undisputed leader of Athens, the man who had turned the city into a maritime superpower. But Pericles was a man of cold, calculated logic, a man of marble. When he met Aspasia, something shifted. He divorced his wife, a move that was legal but socially scandalous, and began living with Aspasia as if they were married. Because she was a foreigner, they could never technically wed under the very laws Pericles himself had passed. This created a massive opening for his enemies. To the Athenian people, the fact that their leader was enslaved by a foreign woman was a sign of weakness. It triggered a deep-seated xenophobia and misogyny that the political opposition was all too happy to exploit. The machinery of propaganda in ancient Athens was not found on social media, but on the stage of the theater. The comic poets of the time, like Aristophanes and Hermippus, were the primary weapon of character assassination. They began a relentless campaign to frame Aspasia not as a philosopher, but as a Deianira, a woman who destroys her husband with a poisoned robe. They called her a harlot and a concubine. They accused her of running a high-end brothel, claiming that she kidnapped women from neighboring cities to satisfy the lusts of Pericles and his friends. This was a classic tactic: dehumanize the target by reducing them to their basest parts. If you can convince the mob that a brilliant woman is nothing more than a common criminal, her ideas no longer matter. You don't have to debate a woman. You've already labeled a monster. Things turned deadly in the year 440 BCE during the Samian War. Samos, an island in the Aegean, had revolted against Athenian control. Pericles crushed the rebellion with a brutality that shocked even the Greeks. But the rumor mill quickly found a scapegoat for the violence: Aspasia. Because she was from Miletus, Miletus had a long-standing rivalry with Samos. The narrative was spun that she had whispered in Pericles' ear, convincing him to start a war just to settle a personal grudge from her childhood. This is where we see the shadow power theory in full effect. It is a recurring theme in the dark history of empires. Whenever a leader makes a controversial or violent decision, the public often looks for a whisperer to blame, someone who has bypassed the traditional channels of power. For Athens, Aspasia was the perfect lightning rod. As the tension in Athens reached a breaking point, the political rivals of Pericles realized they couldn't strike him directly. He was too popular, his military record too strong. Instead, they went after the people he loved. This is a psychological strategy of attrition. Break the man by destroying his support system. In the year 432 BCE, Aspasia was officially charged with asabia, or impiety. In Athens, this was a capital offense. It was the same charge that would later kill Socrates. The accusation was that she didn't respect the gods, and that she was corrupting the women of Athens. It was a show trial designed to humiliate Pericles. The most powerful man in Athens was forced to stand in a court of law and weep, begging for the life of the woman he loved. It was a moment of profound vulnerability that his enemies relished. Imagine the sight. The Olympian Pericles, the man who spoke like thunder, reduced to tears before a jury of his peers. She was eventually acquitted, but the damage was done. The invincibility of the Periclean age had been shattered. But the worst was yet to come. In the year 430 BCE, as the Peloponnesian War with Sparta began to grind the city down, a devastating plague struck Athens. The city was overcrowded, filthy, and terrified. Thousands died, and the social fabric began to unravel. In times of mass trauma, the human psyche looks for someone to blame. The people turned on Pericles, and by extension, the woman who shared his bed. They saw the plague as a punishment from the gods for the city's moral decay, a decay they linked directly to the foreign woman and her unnatural influence. Pericles himself caught the plague and died in 429 BCE, leaving Aspasia alone in a city that hated her. What happened next is one of the most intriguing gaps in the historical record. Most women in her position would have fled or vanished into obscurity, but Aspasia was a survivor. One theory suggests she married a wealthy but low-born cattle merchant named Lysicles. To many historians, this seems like a desperate move for survival, but others argue it was her final act of political genius. It's possible that she used her rhetorical skills to turn this merchant into a powerful political figure in his own right, proving that her brilliance wasn't dependent on Pericles, but was an inherent force of nature. If this is true, it suggests a woman who understood the levers of power so well she could build a leader from scratch. However, after the death of Lysicles in 428 BCE, the records go silent. The woman who had been the intellectual center of the Golden Age simply fades away. There are no descriptions of her death, no monuments to her life, and no written works in her own hand that have survived. We are left only with the words of the men who either loved her or loathed her. This is the ultimate erasure. In the study of empires, we often see that the most effective way to kill a legacy is not through execution, but through silence. By depriving her of her own voice, history attempted to turn Aspasia back into a character in someone else's play. But if we look closely at the consensus history of Athens, her fingerprints are everywhere. When we read the works of Plato or Xenophon, we see reflections of her dialectic method. When we look at the funeral oration of Pericles, perhaps the most famous speech in the history of democracy, we have to wonder if the words of freedom and equality were actually whispered to him by a woman who was legally denied both. The tragedy of Aspasia is a mirror for our own times. It shows us how easily fear of the other can be weaponized, and how a society that claims to value logic and reason can be driven to madness by the presence of an independent mind in a marginalized body. The psychological profile of Aspasia is that of a disruptor. She didn't just participate in Athenian society, she questioned its core assumptions by her very existence. Her story is a testament to the power of the intellect to transcend legal and social boundaries. But it is also a cautionary tale about the violence that empires inflict on those who refuse to stay in their place. Athens claimed to be the cradle of democracy, yet it could not tolerate a woman who was its intellectual equal. It's a paradox that still haunts our modern institutions, the gap between the ideals we preach and the people we allow to lead. The investigation into Aspasia's life forces us to confront the great man theory of history. For centuries, we have been told that the Golden Age was the work of a few brilliant men. But when we pull back the curtain, we find a woman from Miletus, an outsider, a hetaira who was the intellectual anchor for the entire project. Her madness was simply her refusal to be invisible. Her crime was her ability to see the world more clearly than the men who ruled it. The propaganda against her was so successful that even today, many people hear her name and think only of a mistress. But the reality is that Aspasia was the mind that sharpened the sword of Athens. In the final reflection of her life, we are left with a question that echoes through the corridors of power. How many other Aspasias have been buried by the weight of empire? How many voices have been silenced by the same tactics of character assassination and mass manipulation that were used in the 5th century BCE? As we move forward, we must learn to look for the whisperers, not with suspicion, but with a desire to hear the truths that the powerful are trying to hide. The story of Aspasia is not just a story of the past, it is a blueprint for understanding the present. What do you believe was Aspasia's greatest contribution to the world? Was she the true author of the Athenian dream, or was she simply a woman trying to survive in a world that wanted her gone? The ruins of Athens still stand, but the spirit of the woman who lived among them remains a riddle that we are only just beginning to solve.